Hello again, Hayden, and welcome back to our conversation.
Yes, it's good to be together again, Peter. It was another really fun week with folks. Chapters 3 and 4 were quite dense, but gosh, we made a lot of them together, and it was so fun to collaborate in that and share from our lives. And we said chapter 5 and 6 would be a little bit easier, but we may have accidentally fibbed there. Chapter 5, at least, was still quite challenging, I thought, Peter.
I realized that myself as I worked through it, putting together the handout. You and I and others may recognize in this chapter that Halik is starting to pull together some of the threads that he's laid out in chapters 1 through 4, which at least starts to feel less introductory.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he is still using his amazing background in philosophy and historical theology in order to think about these things. And so he takes us on this tour of all of these figures and their thought worlds. And you know, that can feel a bit daunting, I'm afraid. And I really came to realize that as my opening note on the handout indicates.
Yes.
So I do really think it's helpful to recognize, we've talked about the titles of the chapters being important. And I think it's important to recognize that in this chapter, the title of the chapter, I Want You to Be, which of course is also the title of the book, is actually his answer to the third question he asks in this chapter.
Okay, so there are 3 questions in this chapter, Peter.
I think I see him addressing 3 questions. And he kind of builds his way to the third question and therefore to the answer, which is, I want you to be, through the first 2 questions. And that first question, I think, it comes out of his experience in communist Czechoslovakia, I think. Was it here or was it an earlier chapter where he said when he was growing up, being an atheist was like the thing to be, in fact, officially?
Yeah, I think that's right, Peter. I think it was an earlier chapter that he says that.
Yeah. So in his background, and actually I think across Europe generally, the surveys, the public opinion surveys say that Europe is far less religious than America is. And so I think the first question he's trying to address is this sort of condescending challenge that some of us probably have heard too from certain friends or family. How can you be so naive and parochial as to actually believe in God? Isn't God dead?
Yeah, that does sound familiar, Peter, both to me and I'm sure to many of us.
How do you hear Halik addressing that question?
Yeah, in some ways, I think this first question of the chapter gives Halik a chance to review a lot of the ground he's covered already in a new way. By talking about, we talked a little bit about this fully transcendent God that the scientific atheists sort of pointed us to in the last chapter, and this sort of domesticated God that in a way secular humanists pointed us to in the last chapter. And Halik is adamant to, say if those are the gods that have died, so to speak, all the better. And in a way, I think he says that again in this chapter, that if that's the form of religion that's declined, that might as well be a good thing. If God is out there as a competitor, well, that's not really a God that we need to worry about. And if God is just something inside me, a sort of projection of my wishes or hopes, Marx's opium of the people or whatnot, then perhaps that's not really the God that we're concerned with either. But if all of that is true, then I think, as Halik has said before, and as Taylor, who he's drawing on, also says, then this so-called decline in religion that you put in quotes aptly, I think, Peter, becomes more complicated, whether it be on the European continent or in the United States, because there's a sense in which that growing realization that something about those popular conceptions of God is inadequate. There's also something fuller to remember about the riches of a faithful Christian take on who and what God is. And I think in a lot of ways, what I appreciate about how you've lined this out, Peter, is that the rest of the chapter is an attempt to sort of do that responsibly.
Yeah.
And that attempt continues even into chapter 6. But is that how you see some of this playing out?
Yeah, very much so. I think there are some strong threads that run through here. And this first question, in a sense, sets up the trajectory that he's going to follow. Then that second question, where he turns to the whole question of ethics and how do we understand our place in the world using Linnaeus' threefold options of onomies, of the laws that govern life. If it's heteronomy, then some other force governs my life. If it's autonomy, then I govern my life. And Linnaeus suggests, and Halik endorses, the idea that we want to live in a theonomy where God governs my life. But I think that the two alternatives are the alternatives he's already talked about in terms of the gods he's happy to see die. Because in a heteronomy where there's an outside authority that just gives me the rules to live by, I have no responsibility. I'm not responsible for making up the rules. I'm not responsible for making decisions. I'm only responsible to obey or disobey. But that's not even, in a sense, responsibility. That's obedience. I don't think of my dog as being responsible because it obeys me. I think of people as responsible because they have multiple choices and they can shape how they act. So that, what he labels as the fundamentalist approach to religion, heteronymous, in a sense resolves me of responsibility. The autonomy, which he identifies with atheism, means whatever I decide is right by definition, because I am a law unto myself, autonomy. So that way, there's no place for self-criticism. I don't need self-criticism because myself is making the decisions, and how can myself be wrong if there's no other authority to answer to? So both of those, atheism and fundamentalism, the objective competitor God who makes those external rules, right? Or the totally subjective, irrelevant, unreal, projected God who's just a projection of myself. We're starting to see him line up these things as alternatives. And he wants to find a third option.
So before we talk about that third option, Peter, I want to just make sure I'm understanding. So if I'm remembering right, I'm not even sure Halik uses the word ethics in this chapter, but your point is that this whole notion of governance, which we pick up from this nomos, which is that Greek word for law or command, or
governance. I like that.
Or governance, yeah. In a way, invites us to think about ethics. In other words, how we live our lives and what we draw on to act, to put it one way. Is that right?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, we know this onomy suffix or ending or in our English vocabulary directly from the Greek nomos. We know it in agronomy. Help me with some of the other words. Economy. All of those onomy words are talking about the system within which we live, whether it's an agricultural system or an economic system or one of the others.
Yeah.
So he's talking about the system in which we live, and therefore where not only my identity, but the rules of the road
Yeah.
come from outside, from inside, or from God. And here he goes back to what he's been developing in the first few chapters, where he says, God is not an object out there. God is not just a person like, my subject person, but God is this very uh, presence of being that infuses creation and also extends beyond creation. And that's
Yeah.
what he wants, that's where he wants to find his orienting point for both identity and behavior.
Wow. So I think this is going to be a lot for us to unpack with folks, Peter, because my own sense, and I could be off here, is that when people think of God governing life, we sort of have a caricature of that in our American Christianity, which looks a lot like fundamentalism or going to the Bible for some kind of direct instruction from God. And we've even talked in these groups about God as the other,
Yep.
which is what that heteros means, right? And yet we've played with this idea that the transcendence of God is not just about God's otherness, but somehow about God in the depths,
Right.
and even in the depths of ourselves. And so as we get to this idea of theonomy and what it means for God to govern our lives, that we're not just talking about the Bible as a rule book, that we're talking about something deeper than that. And we're also not just talking about listening to God's nudges in our own heart as if that were all of it, that it's somehow putting all of that together with our experience in a community of faith to get at this notion of what it would even mean for God to govern our life.
Right.
The other direction I go, or an image from scripture that seems to capture some of this, is that image that I think might be familiar to some, of this delegated responsibility in Genesis 1, where God creates humans in God's own image and says, you take care of the creation. It's a little bit like Jesus with the disciples in the feeding of the 5,000, when the disciples say, we don't know what to do. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat.
Right.
So there's something about this life in the biosphere of God's love that demands some creativity and some action on our part, and that some organic life that is not mere obedience like you're talking about, but is also more than just from ourselves.
Right. And that's where I identified this. And I think eventually Halik gets to some of this language, but I've identified it here as, yes, we have to be responsible. We have responsibility. We are given by God in Genesis 1, as you say, we are to have dominion. And that means we're responsible for a domain. At the same time, we have to be self-critical because we're not God. And our dominion is answerable to the one who gave us dominion.
Yes.
And that God is other, not as an object is other. Halik was clear about this. It's not the way an object is other, and it's not the way another subject is other. God is other in the way that God transcends our understanding of subject and object.
Yeah.
And so and this is where he then comes to what ends up being the third question, which is, well, if God's not an object that I can pin down, define, and if God's not a subject, but God is not absent or unreal, which is the atheism, which leaves me autonomous and without any self-criticism, then I'm dealing with an uncertainty. There's a presence of God which I can't pin down. How do I deal with that? And
So we're
this is
back to
where
asking questions.
go ahead.
Oh, we're back to asking questions.
This is where Halik comes to his third question, and finally to the title of the chapter in the book, because he wants to know if God is not such an object that I can contain God, or that God just delivers instructions to me. And if God is not absent or unreal, so that I have complete autonomy and I do whatever I want, if God is not totally containable, but God is not absent, then I'm dealing with something that's uncertain. And that's ultimately where Halik ends up with our encounter with God, right? Is a measure of uncertainty. It gets us back to God is as much a question as an answer. And the question of how do I then function? How do I relate to something about which I'm essentially uncertain is, he says, well, it's in the very relationship. The relationship continues. But for the relationship to continue, I have to want you to be.
Yeah.
I want you, God, to be. And I have to want you, other people, to be, because you are where I find God at all in the world in a relatable way. This idea that the sacred is in the world, so I have to be responsive to you, but the sacred is more than what's in the world. And so I can't completely run things the way I choose to or the way I perceive you. And it's your very otherness that gives me the check on what I think you are or God is or must be. It's what keeps things a little bit uncertain, as we know in all relationships.
Right. But then at the same time, it's also my otherness that checks your, well, sorry, not my otherness. Rather, it's God's extension beyond merely the world
Right.
that checks my voice or my presence being your only guidepost
Right.
in the conversation, as it
Right.
were.
Right.
Sorry, it took me a second to gather that, but you got it.
It's fine. That's fine. I think other people got it too. This is Halik's phrase, this way of being in a relationship that isn't controllable or exactly definable, but nevertheless persistent, consistent, extended. This is where he talks about giving our existential consent. It's that I want you to be, I want you to exist. What, whoever you are, and I'll never understand that completely, but our relationship is crucial, and it's what I'm committed to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's his notion of existential consent.
Yeah. And that to me makes more sense too of this idea of faith as yearning, because I'm yearning for God to exist
Yeah,
uh, at a sort of gut level,
yeah,
uh, without reducing God to just being what I'm wishing. It's nevertheless out of my deep core that
right.
I'm longing for God to exist, whoever God is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Isn't that interesting? And this is where I think some of his phrasing struck me as a Lutheran as sort of revealing of some of the otherness of Halik as a Roman Catholic.
Sure.
So on page 64, he talks about God's presence in my life requires me to have that yearning that I want. And my born Lutheran skin just got creepy crawly because Luther is just so clear about how God's presence, God's love of us, God's grace, God's salvation of us, God's everything cannot depend on me, because I will be unfaithful, I will be unreliable, I will be sinful, I will finally fail. And so when Halik says that God's presence in my life depends on my yearning, it's like, uh-oh. And yet, because this is a problem, right? I mean, we know in our lives, we don't want our salvation to depend on ourselves, but we also have trouble believing that we don't have some part in the relationship that saves us, right? That relationship that I call faith.
Mm-hmm.
So then I wonder whether Halik talking about yearning hits a kind of happy middle ground that isn't just the passivity of I don't have anything to do with this. God just does it all, and I become a passive object. And what Luther worries about, that somehow it's my work of yearning, or my work of believing, or my work of accepting what God offers, that turns me into the one with the power to determine my own salvation or not.
Yeah. What I'm struck by, Peter, is that, and without getting too technical here, it's also fair to Halik that at the beginning of the next chapter, he does, in a Roman Catholic way, put the ball back in God's court, so to speak. He does have a way of talking about Jesus's words, "You did not choose me, and but I chose you," and of Augustine's comments that my choosing of you only is happening because of your choosing of me. My loving of you is only happening because of your love for me. And for Halik to resonate with those words also seems to find resonance with Luther, I think. And with our Lutheran tradition, it's fair to say, because insofar as from my own sort of study of Luther in seminary and other places, insofar as Luther even touches this sort of mystical idea of love of God, it seems to me that it happens when Luther is talking about being so wrapped up in the biosphere that we yearn for God. Yeah. And Luther calls some of that yearning faith. And he doesn't call it faith in a way that our yearning gets anything from God. He is just so convinced that we can indeed get wrapped up in that biosphere of God's love proclaimed to us, that we start to yearn for it. And that is the work of the Spirit in our midst. So is that entirely passive? Well, that may have been some of Luther's way of talking about it. And yet it certainly didn't look passive. And I think that's maybe part of Halik's point, that it's a much more dynamic relationship that's alive. Yeah. Luther does say faith is this living and active thing. And in that way is not dead at all, in the way that Halik talks about a potential downfall of faith. Right.
Yeah. If there is not that yearning I want, then faith becomes just the dead thing that loses its, It's salty, it's spicy saltiness.
Yes.
Fit only to be trodden underfoot, as it so often is.
Yes. Now, if Luther and Halik were to meet in heaven, would Luther roll over a little bit? Sure. But that's probably the case for me and Luther too, and probably for just about any of us.
Absolutely. Well, you've moved us into chapter 6 very helpfully, Hayden. Thank you.
Oh, great.
And this one, I think, gets a bit easier for us to work with. Halik is talking about the closeness of God. And he believes that this yearning for God that he's talked about in chapter 5 can bring us closer to God, can give us a feeling of God's closeness, but he's still concerned about these false understandings of God and closeness to God that occupied him already in chapter 5 as well. And I think he gets at it in somewhat more helpful ways here. One of the things, when I was in seminary, one of my professors was a Midwesterner, and I have to admit to my own shame that when I was going to seminary in Philadelphia and I had only ever lived on the East Coast and the West Coast, that I don't have a clue where he was from. I just knew it was, quote, the Midwest. But it was farm country. And Lyman Lundeen would tell us that in doing Lutheran theology, one of the crucial things about doing Lutheran theology is like driving a farm road.
Okay.
Where you've got a ditch on each side, and you've got a certain amount of leeway that you can maneuver on that road. The key is don't fall into either ditch. And we repeatedly talk about these, the ditch on the one side and the ditch on the other side that we needed to avoid. And I think in some ways Halik does this as well, because once again, he talks about ways in which we can take God to be too close, right? So on the one hand, our yearning for God can become this kind of sentimentality or complacency. And this is where he talks about it's losing its spicy saltiness, right? So it's not as though, as you were suggesting, oh, it's just totally passive, I don't have anything. No, faith is a living and active thing, right? So we can't just become sentimental or passive and complacent. That's the ditch on one side. But then the ditch on the other side is that we simply let the closest to God be, oh, well, God's within me. So whatever I feel is right or important, that's what I should do. And it's all guided by my humanism or by my one of my other isms, a socialism or a communism or a capitalism or a Zionism or a you name your ism, and it becomes grounded in who I am because God is so close, too close, and I start to identify my own worldview with the way God looks at things.
Yeah. So those are the ditches, right?
Those are the two ditches, right? Mm-hmm. And that this is the same thing he's been talking about, objective or subjective, heteronomic or autonomic. And so he keeps doing these same parallel, that's the image of the ditch, right? Like it changes, but they're still both the same ditch going down the farm road. So, but then in talking about the closeness of God, the title for this chapter, he goes on to say, but this is how close God is. God is as close as the neighbor, because this is where we find the other that is God in our world, if we grant that neighbor their full otherness. Now, of course, he goes into, Levinas and Buber and all of those philosophers, but the idea that you as my neighbor, Hayden, are totally other than I am. I will never fully comprehend who you are, no matter how long our relationship goes on.
It strikes me, Peter, that in some ways, we've started to touch on this idea in our conversations with both groups already. And that gives me confidence that of two things, really. First, that as we get to this point in chapter 6, Halik is going to be more readable. I think we can hope.
Fingers crossed, please God,
Please, Lord, come Holy Spirit.
Exactly.
And I at the same time, just because Halik becomes more readable here doesn't mean that he becomes more livable, right? In other words, this is where we hit some other hard life questions. And I really like the way you've put it here. In a world where giving priority to the other over I is not a cultural norm, what is being asked of us?
Yeah.
How do we do that?
Yeah.
You know, it's similar to the question we asked last week, but we have so much more to work with, from our conversations that we shared to these additional chapters to now this time that we've spent. We again just get to dig into that in a new way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Nicely pointed for where we might begin or where we might end, or certainly where we will journey together in the further discussion this week. So thank you much, Hayden. This is so much fun exploring all of this together and doing it with both of the groups, which have been in some ways, I think, heroic about their digging into Halik, and or maybe it's not digging in, maybe it's letting him wash over us, whatever the metaphor is. We're pretty
Something like that.
We're pretty deep into them, and
We are.
And getting deeper with one another as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter.